So I'm going to get started with our next presenter, who is Aaron Jeutter from Rockwell Automation. Aaron has 25 years of experience in software development and project management. He is a SAFe 4 Certified Practitioner, SAFe 4 Certified Agilist, Project Management Professional, and Certified Scrum Master. Aaron also volunteers as a virtual judge with Project Lead the Way through the Milwaukee School of Engineering, and he has been using Slim for 6 years.
I'll start off with a quick discussion here on the background and some of the challenges that led to this estimation approach. But I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail there. Then I will jump into describing the reasoning behind the Big Rock estimation approach and how it fits in with Agile methodologies. And then in the performing section, I will walk through the process and steps for an estimation session. And then finally, I'll tie in getting the results from this process into a Slim estimate. So as I'm sure most people already are aware, many projects start with high-level and unclear requirements. And going into this, a lot of in those situations, teams are asked to put together estimates, based off of those, unknown requirements, and that's used to develop a funding project schedule, and then those teams are held accountable for for these estimates, which can lead into many challenging discussions in the future. Some of the methods that I've used and worked with the teams on include top-down, bottom-up, decomposition, expert judgment, and again, there's a plethora of other methods that can be used as well. So, why big rocks? We've had a number of people at Rockwell that try to look at it as a big mountain of work that needs to be estimated. Other people look at all the little tiny details and all the pebbles, but really what we want to do is, and this kind of gets into the decomposition part of, we want to break it down into big rocks. And again, this kind of came out of a number of planning sessions that we've held over the years that we did for a number of projects. Not everyone at Rockwell uses this approach. It's mainly specific to my part of Rockwell, but this has been very useful for us to determine rough order of magnitude estimates for initial funding requests in our organization. And that, coming out of that, this, and again, this method can be used to help determine the labor costs and that support the major funding milestones. And at Rockwell, we usually have, gated milestones that allow us to, again, do some initial governance of a project. We do initial funding, and then once we get enough understanding of the scope of the project, then we will go back and provide a better estimate of the work. So, and again, this method, kind of leverages and follows the basic premises of, shown here. One person is only one point of view. If you get a group of people, you usually get a better estimate, and actually can get, through discussions, you can even zero in on some of the risks and potential complexities. Again, under Agile, your estimates won't be perfect. Some will be high, some will be low. And, this method does, extensively leverage the statistical property of law of large numbers. Because, in some cases you'll have some items that you think are, very large, but they end up being not as big. And then you come across some items that you thought, oh, well, that's going to be really easy. And then you have a lot of discoveries that kind of take you in the wrong direction. This estimate also forces choice points of the estimates. So if something, it's going to be bigger than your, what we'll talk about is a reference size, you force it to the next size up. And again, one of the things that you want to do is try to align the activity to a common schedule. Usually if you have a known funding schedule, for example, some projects, some companies have projects that are funded on a quarterly timeline or whatnot. So you want to try and get some of that estimation pre-work and the estimation completed ahead of those. And then, you want to ground, when do you, once the funding's in place, when do you think you're really going to start? That helps determine, when are you going to be done with certain aspects of the project. And then, when you look at the when you start scoping out the epics or portfolio items or, whatever it is that you're doing to however you decompose the work, you really want to, focus on the expected scope, the complexity, and the risk. Try to avoid jumping into the, effort days, saying, oh, well, that's going to take me 2 weeks. Don't go down that path because, one person's 2 weeks is another person's 2 months. So we want to try and avoid that here. So the Big Rocks approach really does leverage, two well-known methods, and that's decomposition and expert judgment. These are, again, very useful, especially when you're trying to take something that might be an unknown or somewhat familiar and break it down into, understandable pieces. The results of this approach can be directly fed into Slim Estimate, and then, once you get into the tool, you can use your own organization's historical projects. You can compare it against industry standards, and then you can also make adjustments based off your product life cycles. So in some cases, an organization may follow, the waterfall methodology, or if you're doing straight Scrum, or if you're doing scaled Agile, you can adapt this for whatever makes sense for your organization. So for actually performing the Big Rock estimation, I think I'm probably going a little bit too fast here, but so the basic agenda consists of going through and doing the introductions of the stakeholders, discussing the ground rules for the workshop. So there's some you're going to have the key team members that are responsible for owning the actual estimates. You're going to have some domain experts that are not necessarily part of that product team, but can help provide insights and guidance as you kind of go through some of the different rocks that that are part of the project scope. You're going to have some people that are more at the upper management or program management level that are really interested to either observe the process or to get an understanding of what areas are the teams identifying as risks that may need to be addressed in addition to the project scope. Again, that you have some ground rules there that who owns what responsibilities as part of that. Do an agenda walkthrough. So in some cases, if you're going to have a 2-day session of going through and doing the estimation, you'll want to plan for breaks. You'll want to plan for maybe early on you might have some architecture presentations. Some insights that can be shared with the estimation team prior to actually jumping into the estimation effort. There's some pre-work review. So again, prior to doing all of the estimation, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, there's some pre-work that really needs to be done before actually going through the estimation session. And so it's important to review that, what was prepared in that, and that pre-work is actually what you're going to be following through to perform the sizing. There's sizing grounding, and that's where you establish some baseline epics, for the sizing comparisons. You'll find that you'll need to do the, is it bigger than this or smaller than that type of comparisons. And then the actual estimation, which is basically a repetitive cycle, very much a rinse and repeat, and go through each of the elements identified during the pre-work. And then finally doing a review and wrap-up. And that I'll go into that a little bit more, but for the wrap-up, a lot of times you may not have, have all the information until after you've analyzed the results of the estimation. So for the pre-work, realistically, this is this is the decomposition phase of doing the estimates. This really should be done at least a week prior to the sizing event. I've had a number of cases where folks are very interested to get a preview of what is the breakdown coming from the of the architectural elements, or what are the things that we're going to have to think about prior to going into this estimation session. It also allows team members to prepare some early questions, or to ask the questions so that they have the answers as they get into the estimation session. And again, that it's basically going to be an outline that breaks out all the big rocks, epics, portfolio items, whatever your terminology is. Ideally, you want to have a small group of knowledgeable people, usually about 2 or 3, to help define that initial structure if something isn't already available. In the cases where you have a product that's very similar to a previous product, if you're doing a new next generation, for example, you may be able to leverage the existing architectural elements and use that as part of the baseline and starting point for building out what that structure needs to be, or that outline needs to be. If it's if you're doing a clean slate design approach, you'll still want to have involvement from an architectural group to help kind of frame out and define some of the major elements that that the product or project are going to need to be scoped to. And again, the key here is to capture this information that can be used in the future during the estimation session. So the recommendation that I normally use is to keep it to about 3 levels of epic or portfolio items. The top level is really an executive high-level description of a feature or functionality or architectural element. The second level is where you have some key stakeholders, where you have your SMEs that have may have some again high-level or manager-level information. And then the third level, and if you need to go to deeper levels, that's where the development team or the engineer level descriptions should be provided. Again, the more detail and more complexity should be kept to the lower levels, and then and backing up the the number of first level epics ideally should be kept to about 10 items or less. If you find that the project scope or what you're preparing for the estimation session is significantly larger, you will probably want to break it down, break this down into multiple estimation sessions. What could happen is, if you have a 1 or 2 day session, and that covers everything you need to do, you don't have the risk of burnout like you would have if you have a 4 day or a full week worth of meetings where you're basically going and looking at all the different epics. All right, so from a logistics standpoint, for this to be successful, you really do need to keep this down to a 1 or 2 day session. Again, like I mentioned before, if you have it too long, you will definitely run into cases where people will get burned out from, from just being in the meeting and the continuous review of all the different items and the discussions. The key participants involved in the sizing should be the people on the team implementing the final product. This is important because, again, someone that's not necessarily in the implementation team might be a subject matter expert. that person may not be on the team actually implementing the function, and that person may provide incorrect influence on how complex or what the scope may be from a sizing standpoint. It might be really easy for a subject matter expert, but it might be very overwhelming for somebody that's only been working on that area for a couple of years, or even someone that's fresh out of school. Stakeholders outside of the team can participate. Again, that's where subject matter experts are useful, but mainly the intent there is to have them being available to help clarify the expected scope. So from a product management standpoint, or whoever is writing the specifications, it's good to have those people there to help the team clarify some of the requirements. And there might actually be some discoveries from the whoever's providing the requirements of, oh, I didn't provide enough detail or enough information on that. Again, this allows for some a close feedback loop as you're going through and determining what the scope of the effort is for a project. And then non-technical participants certainly can attend as observers. I think the analogy in a lot of with Scrum is the chicken and the pig, and I'm not going to go into that, but most of the non-technical participants are really going to be chickens. So they're outside looking in, and they don't necessarily have skin in the game. All right, so for sizing and grounding, this is pretty important as well. This is used to help establish a common understanding of what is being used for scope, complexity, risk when actually sizing these epics or big rocks. And again, it's really important to make sure that that's the focus and not necessarily, it'll take me 2 weeks to do that. That's not really what we want to cover in this type of a sizing session. We want to know, is this a simple thing and low risk, or is this going to be high risk and high complexity? That helps determine how big you're going to be trying to size some of these items. For example, a less complex time-consuming activity will take, could easily have the same size as a more complex short-duration activity. The methods I usually use is T-shirt sizing to help, determine, to help kind of lead the team in this comparative sizing. Some folks use things like farm animals or different dogs. Is it a Chihuahua or is it a standard poodle? That sort of thing. Again, I prefer using the T-shirts as the sizing approach. All right. So for the T-shirt sizing, I have a table here. As a minimum, I recommend sizing at least two, identifying two epics or big rocks as the baselines. Extra small and medium are usually the ones I usually go with. You can go with small and large, or or whatnot. But again, that's when you start off. The team should agree that those, the baseline epics are understood and agree that, that would be appropriate for that particular T-shirt size. If you don't have agreement or consensus, then it's certainly worth reviewing the list of in the outline to identify any other candidates for what you could consider a small, medium, large, extra small, or whatnot. I normally create a chart with these brackets for the team to reference during the session. I'll use a flip chart or a whiteboard so that it's always up and visible as we're reviewing the outline of the big rocks. And then then the remaining baselines can be identified as you're going through the sizing. So, for example, let's say your team has identified extra small, small, and medium, but they haven't come across a one that's larger than a medium until like 2 hours into the session. It's like that one's a lot bigger than the medium. That we should use this one as a comparison point for our large, and that certainly can be done as again. It's up to the facilitator to make sure that that gets captured, and it helps for the ongoing discussions as you're going through the different epic sizing. All right, so from a flow standpoint, really the facilitator is responsible for leading the team through all the steps of doing the estimation. You should capture any of the parking lot items. There might be some rat holes that need to be explored, but they could get in the way of getting through the estimation. You can say them as parking lots that you can cover during a planned break or during lunch or at the end of a day session. And then these steps are performed for every epic that was identified during the pre-work phase. If the team is not able to get to a consensus on a T-shirt size of one of these items, it's perfectly fine to skip over it and go back to it later. Again, if some additional discussion on one of those items needs to be held, during one of the breaks to help do the clarification, and then the team can always go back to it later on. And I have a couple of reminders here. This is a rough order of magnitude size, not a detailed estimate. You really won't know the actual scope until you're almost done with the project. So, again, this is to kind of get things going, not necessarily to tell you exactly, you're going to be done on such and such date with this many people. And again, the goal of this activity is to get through all the epics, with a reasonable epic or reasonable size, with the consideration focused on complexity and risk. So on this slide are the basic steps. And realistically, the first thing you want to do is look at it and say, is it small enough to size within 5 minutes? Do you have enough information? Do you have enough details? Do you understand the complexity and potential scope? If you do, then go ahead and do the sizing. Otherwise, if it's too big or too complex, you may need to have it broken down into sub-epics. This may be something that is you can quickly do because you have enough of the subject matter experts there, or you may need to do that during a planned break. So when you do review the epic, again, try to keep it to about 5 minutes or less. I've had some sessions where the discussion was productive, and we'd go for up to 10 or 15 minutes. And in the end, some of them would end up getting sized to the point accurately, or at least reasonably well enough that the team was able to get consensus. So again, the estimators should state the size of the epic. I've had a few experiences where there were a few vocal people that pretty much said, "Yep, this is how big it is," and there's other stakeholders that were not, didn't really weigh in, or they just remained silent because they were intimidated or whatnot. And as a facilitator, you need to pay attention to that. Definitely, take advantage of using the planning poker cards like what's used in Scrum, or use another silent method, or you just flat out do a person-by-person roll call. And if necessary, it may be to the point where you have to say, is this more or less complex than a medium-sized epic? And you point to the baseline epics, and that's really, the important part is, understanding that those baselines are intended for use for identifying, the size. you may have a few of the items where it's 1 or 2 minutes and they say, yeah, everyone understands what this is. That's going to be a large. We know what that is. We've done that before. It's never easy. It's never small, and it's going to be that amount of work. In cases where you have people that are estimating high and estimating low, just like in Scrum sizing, have the teams talk about, what is how big is it, why are you estimating higher, why are you estimating lower, and you may have someone may understand the complexity, or maybe there's some additional things that aren't captured in the scope that may have an impact. So maybe you're going to be changing from a particular unit test tool to a different unit test tool that wasn't captured as part of the scope. Well, that means that you're going to end up having to, you may have some risk with adopting the new tool that needs to be taken into consideration. And again, the estimators should come to a consensus for the sizing. And again, the facilitator records the result, and you rinse and repeat through basically every item. It's tedious and time-consuming, but you have the commitment from coming out of this. You have a reasonably consistent commitment that the team can go to the table with for these initial wrong estimates. Okay, I'm actually going a little bit faster than in my practice sessions. All right, so estimation, review, and wrap up. So, really, when you get to the end of the estimation session, you should review the parking lot for any open items that need to be discussed. If there's some follow-on work or some homework that needs to be performed, or if another session needs to be scheduled, talk about it and make sure that gets covered. If there's any other concerns or outstanding issues, again, work through that. One of the hazards is that everyone will want to know what the answer is. Everyone will want to know, so how big is it? How much work do we think it is? You're not going to be able to provide that information during the review session. So I highly recommend setting up a readout session for providing the answer. You will need to take the results and work with it in Slim Estimate to determine, okay, what how does this work with my organization, working through again the comparative projects and such in the tool. So finally, getting into tying in with Slim Estimate. So I put together an example, and I believe Elizabeth will be able to make this available to interested participants. It's a simple spreadsheet that that kind of lines up with this approach. So what we have here is in the left column is the parent portfolio items, or the level 1 epics, and then I only went to 2 levels here, so 13 second level epics for the children. And then the sizes here, again, would be selected by the technical leads that were in the estimation session. Again, it depends on the size of the program. It could be, that it'll be a full Scrum team, or it might be multiple Scrum teams. Whoever the appropriate stakeholders and participants are the people that are providing the sizes here. All right, so again, that spreadsheet, I have a mapping that I've used in the past for the T-shirt sizing. So extra small here is like, for example, 40 points, small is 100. All these numbers are actually based off of the modified Fibonacci series. In general, most of these, I go with these estimates as being the most likely case when you're working with tools like Slim Estimate. All right, and so again, this is in the spreadsheet. So when working with the sizing prioritized features template, I found that I need to kind of reorganize the information a little bit. So I set up a table that matches the structure of that template. and I created a lookup that basically fills in the low and high numbers for that sizing template. And again, it uses most likely and then provides low and high for feeding into the tool. And finally, you can basically just take it out of this tool, copy and paste it into the Slim import template here. So, again, I just, for this example, I just set the input to story points, the output to implementation units, and I just set the conversion factors as shown here. And then this is the example of what it would look like in the template tool. And then the last step is you import it into Slim Estimate, and that's where you can actually use the tool to do, to refine your results, to do the what-if analyses, whatever steps you normally would take in using Slim Estimate to develop the size, the scope, and the estimate for your project. All right, so this method does enable teams and stakeholders to have the discussions regarding the scope, complexity, and risk. I have found that, and actually this has happened just about every time I've hosted one of these sessions where we would go in deep, compose the scope based off of the expert understanding. We've always had some very productive and constructive discussions around what the expectations are with the scope, and and that's actually driven into some changes in what how people are defining the scope, or what is in scope and what is not in scope. This can be adapted to different business needs or different approaches in software development. So pure Scrum, this can certainly be adapted to that. Scrum Agile, my organization recently moved to Scrum, Scaled Agile, and so I'm still collecting the data for that, but I'm finding that this is actually very useful in doing some of the pre-planning for each of the program increments. And again, performing iterations of the of estimation with this method is definitely helps a lot to help force the teams to help refine the project scope, especially in a safe approach where you're forcing the discussions of, okay, here are the features that we want to include in this next PI or in this product release. How big is that? How much work is it going to be? Is it going to be? Are we going to be able to fit it in this PI, or is some of this going to be have to be part of an architectural runway? Things like that need to be can come out of the discussions as part of this estimation. And again, a lesson learned is coming out of the first sizing session. The results will be unacceptable to key stakeholders. I don't think I've gone through a single session where everyone said, "Hey, that's great, that's perfect. We'll start moving forward with what you gave us for the estimate." Generally, it's again, it gets back down to clarifying the scope and the complexity of the product. How much risk is the business willing to take on for for that particular project? It encourages it encourages the discussions. It helps the teams teams and the stakeholders break things down into smaller, doable chunks. And again, once you've completed, refining the scope, definitely do another sizing session. And again, like I said, iterations are very helpful, especially with, depending on the size and scope of the project. Okay, I think I went through a little bit, a little fast. I guess, Elizabeth, are there any questions?
Yeah, that's not a problem. We can definitely open everything up to questions now if you guys have questions. With that, I'll get started with the first question. Have you found any benefit in assigning a factor to complexity and risk and multiplying the size, epic points, with it so that the impacts of size and complexity are separated from size and the in the discussion?
No, I have not done that. That I mean I think that's where it varies from organization to organization. If it makes sense for you to do something like that in your as part of your sizing, I would actually bake it in. I'll go back here a little bit. I would actually bake it into how you do your mapping of the T-shirt size to the epic points. The whole point of doing the estimation session is to capture the T-shirt size, not necessarily determine how many points it's going to be. And again, complexity and risk are important, but I would say that they could easily have the same weight on the sizing uh, of an epic or a feature.
How long have you been using this method, and is it a standard within your organization?
So I have been using this for about not quite 4 years, and no, it is not a standard within an organization. My group has used it. We've only had a few projects in flight right now. We do most of our projects are very large multi-year programs, so we have done this for only a handful of projects, probably less than 10.
Okay. Can you discuss what challenges you encountered getting your organization to embrace scope estimation versus estimating directly in effort days?
Everybody jumps to trying to size it in effort days. Every planning session that or estimation session that I've done, everybody always wants to jump into the days, and sometimes that's part of the kind of setting up the ground rules for the discussions. Is that if we're not really trying to size or estimate based off of how many person days are, again, because the example I used earlier is that someone that might be a subject matter expert may say it's only going to take a certain amount of time, but the people actually doing the work will need more time to do that. Either it's because they don't have enough of the domain experience, or there might be some other things that may come up. So for example, it's a brand new set of development tools that the team hasn't used before. It could be any number of complexities. Maybe there's some issues with the development environment. It could be maybe there's a server conversion going on. You're doing an upgrade on all of your systems to a new version of Windows Server, and there may be some unexpected circumstances or some things that get piled on when you go to do those upgrades that people may or may not be aware of.
To confirm, your epic points are the same regardless of the portfolio item, right?
So the epic points that I'm using map to the T-shirt sizes. So it's not really easy to see here. So for example, I map the T-shirt size to the for extra small. So the first one here on the list, Ethernet stack integration, that's extra small. Extra small is 40 points. There's some other epics that have different, that have medium or small or large, and each of those epic points have their own mapping. So, but each epic may have a different size.
Could you give an example of defining the baseline size for epics?
Give an example. Okay, so give an example. So I'll use. I was going to use communications testing as an example for medium. So when you're doing a communications testing suite for a product, you would probably want to have it based off of single, the basic functionality tests. You'll want to do stress testing. You'll want to do security testing. You'll want to do, again, what is your product going to be exposed to from a communication standpoint? Do you have messaging in a client server only application, or do you have mirroring where you have multiple servers that need to be sharing information? Are you doing a distributed system? Again, what is the scope of, again, those could be part of the scope of doing the communications testing. That would be certainly a medium one. If you're doing for a small DevOps updates, so for example, you're building off of an existing infrastructure system. From a DevOps standpoint, you need to create, add build configurations to your CI/CD system. You need to be able to add artifact storage. You'll need to set up build agents for compiling and building your product. It could be things like that. Again, those are going to be small activities because the initial outlay might be maybe part of the initial updates, and there would be some ongoing maintenance and support that would be included as part of the scope of the DevOps updates.
How do you size at the end of the project to collect historical data?
I haven't, since my main project hasn't finished yet, it's been going for the past 5 years. What I've been doing is during the different program increments, I have been capturing some of the metrics data as we've been progressing. And I started to map that basically from a PI to PI. So we've been working on, so we were doing pure Scrum early on the program, and actually just this past year we've transitioned over to using Scaled Agile, and we've ramped up 2 release trains. So I'm in the process of starting to collect some of that data from those early PIs. We'll probably be throwing away the first 2 PIs because there's there's a lot of learning curve there that we can use. It's useful from a standpoint of saying, okay, if we go to start another release train, how much work is that going? What is the impact of starting up another train? But for our business, we're planning on only having 2 release trains. So usefulness comes in for post initial PIs for the teams, so that we can use that as part of the metrics for future iterations.
Did you face any internal challenges when starting to use top-down estimation on Agile projects? If so, how did you overcome those?
It really wasn't too hard. The biggest challenge is being able to have the right stakeholders from the architecture standpoint. Having the right engagement from the right stakeholders early on. Adopting Agile, that was actually done before I started at Rockwell, so that was probably easier for me. But what it really boils down to is definitely making sure that you have, again, someone from an architectural standpoint weighing in. If you have the right experts involved with the team, it makes it easier to communicate. What is the architecture that your team is following as part of the Scrum Agile.
Does the application type factor in system software, real-time, scientific, business, etc.? Does that make sense? Does the application type factor in?
So most of the products that I'm dealing with are, it's broken down into system software and real time, at least for most of the products that I'm dealing with. The system software aspect is is, for example, the communications, the user interface, and some of the basic, OS interface functions and such. From the real-time standpoint, yes, we do have when I mentioned breaking it up into two different estimation sessions, I would actually have a session with the folks that are focused on the system software. Then I would have, and our real-time software group is a little bit different because we use model-based development for that. So that is a very different paradigm when compared to just doing the handwritten code for system software.
How many estimates do you all typically do each month, and how long does it take approximately to do a release train estimate?
So our PIs are about 10-week intervals. So we would only do about one per PI. So I guess so that's the first part. Can you repeat the second part of the question?
Sure. How long does it take approximately to do a release train estimate?
For the whole train? Um, I would, so I don't know if I can really answer that because, part of doing SAFE is to really look at, what's coming up in the next PI, and then, future work for the subsequent two PIs is usually the best practice. You can certainly do, enough estimation for, for the upcoming PI, but the future PIs may change. My experience has been that we've actually had some significant directional changes for the future PIs, as we've moved forward. So we've had some customer feedback where we threw away everything in the next two future PIs, as we're going through, and we have a completely new plan for the future work. Again, that's part of the tenet of SAFE is to be able to inspect and adapt and adjust based off of customer requests and needs. So for doing an entire train, I don't know if we've done the entire train at all. Again, when we started the particular program that I'm working on now, we were doing full Scrum Agile, and we had done similar big rock sizing, and we've refined the estimates since then, and then we've had additional scope added, and we've had, again, scope changes. So what we started with is not where we're at today. So breaking it down into smaller chunks is probably the best way to approach it if you're trying to do that.